Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Created in the Image of God. I'm Jeremiah Adams, and we are exploring the role of religion in society with our host, Wade Fransson. Wade Fransson is founder of Something or Other Publishing, a groundbreaking model to connect authors and readers. The internet has turned marketing on its head with the introduction of ebooks and publishing on demand. Wade has been a student of the Bible for nearly 4 decades and continues to study it to this day. In terms of the material being covered in tonight's program, I'll let Wade speak to his credentials. Hello, Wade.
Hey there, Jeremiah, and good evening, everyone. We're hopeful that our regular guest will be here shortly, Daniel Sanderson, up in Canada. We have quite an interesting conversation prepared for you today, but not sure if Daniel is otherwise preoccupied. But let me speak to why what I'm going to be presenting tonight is something that I can't even speak to, because the material that we're going to be covering is perhaps a little bit different than what you're used to, but we will definitely tie this into the Bible, to religion, and its role in society. When I resigned from the ministry way back in 1995, I initially pursued teaching for a couple of years and then realized that that wasn't going to provide economically for me and my family in the way that I wanted. And so I began to look towards business. And given that I had quite a lot of experience in the operations of the church, where I later had become a minister, because I served in Europe as the assistant manager of the office for the German region. I was actually being trained to head up the church's operations in Scandinavia due to my language abilities and background. And I was heavily involved in marketing and promotion for the work of the church and a lot of other things. Computer operations, helped set up structures and programs, not directly working with the technology, but smart enough that I could get involved in it. So I managed to transition out of teaching into training in the corporate setting to train how to use software. And from there, I actually migrated into the technology world itself, and I got a master's degree in business administration and ended up doing consulting work within a niche area, to the degree that I came to the attention of Deloitte Consulting, which is one of the world's premier, Deloitte & Touche being the owner parent of Deloitte Consulting, one of the premier accounting and consulting brands on the planet to this day. There were originally, I think it was called the Big Six, then the Big Five, and then the final four major accounting firms, including Ernst & Young. Arthur Andersen was the one that collapsed in the wake of the WorldCom, Enron scandals and whatnot. Anyway, this is all documented, by the way, in my book, my second book, called The Hardness of the Heart. So when I got that MBA and managed to transition into the world of technology, I got this very prestigious role with Deloitte Consulting. And now I was in their strategy and operations group, advising very large corporations on how to manage certain processes, especially related to real estate and technology for their large operations, which actually gave me a lot of insight into those scandals. For example, at Enron, they were taking their real estate off the books, creating special purpose entities to play games, frankly, with their financial reporting to the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC. And all of this is well documented in the movie, the book, and then the movie, The Smartest Guys in the Room, which you should watch. There are then a whole host of other books and documentaries that were made about my next career move, because when I left Deloitte Consulting, after completing my MBA, or as I was about to finish my MBA, I went to work for a company called Countrywide. Now, Countrywide was in the mortgage business, and they became the nation's largest lender, and they had various divisions, including wholesale lending. And they were buying wholesale hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of mortgage paper. And they had a trading floor underneath their headquarters in Calabasas, where they were converting this paper, this mortgage paper, which means the paper that documented the amount of the loans. They were converting this into the proverbial sausage, right? The tranches of securitized debt that was being sold to the proverbial pension fund in Norway. You might recall this time period in the early 2000s and the real estate bubble, and then the near economic collapse of our global economic system. On the January 1st, 2009 Time magazine cover, the CEO of that company, Countrywide, was listed as the #1 cause of the economic meltdown. Now, there could have been any one of 20 other figures put on the cover of that magazine, and it would have, in some sense, been equally true. It's hard to pin the blame on any one person. But the reason it was legitimate that Angela Mazzillo, the CEO of Countrywide, was on the cover of Time magazine in January 2009, I can tell you it was legitimate because I went from Deloitte to do strategic planning for that company to help them to grow from 30 to 60,000 employees as I was working with their real estate operations and performing a location strategy to determine where they should put their big box facilities. Among other things, negotiating with Clark County, I believe it was called, in Vegas to put a facility with 10,000 Countrywide employees in Vegas, for example, for their loan administration department, because they had amassed 1.3 trillion with a T, $trillion worth of servicing rights on all these mortgage-backed securities that they had sold off. And they retained those servicing rights for reasons that aren't even readily understood by some of those people that wrote those books and created those movies. My point being, at that moment in time, I had an insider's look into the way in which the American economy had been expanded into such a bubble based on inflated real estate prices and fraudulent activities that were going on throughout the system in all kinds of different ways, and the role that Countrywide played in that entire inflationary bubble that was so massive that when it burst, it almost destroyed the global economy in 2010. From there, I left Countrywide to do an internet startup in California called GoHuman.com. All of this is documented in my second book, The Hardness of the Heart. And after that internet startup failed, and I had now become engaged, married, and was expecting my first child, I needed to find work that would pay me not in future potential earnings from an internet startup, but rather in hard, cold cash. And so I shopped my resume around and I got a job in Madison, Wisconsin with a company called CUNA Mutual Group, C-U-N-A. CUNA stands for Credit Union National Association. So I went from the world of big banking and mortgage origination, mortgage lending, wholesale lending, and all of that, world of fabrication of wealth by big banks that almost destroyed the entire planet, to the company that is the backbone of the credit union movement. The credit union movement are small, locally owned, not-for-profit financial institutions. So I literally went from having a bird's eye view of how the global economy works in big banking and lending and the creation of wealth through the fabrication of money, through the printing of paper and the inflation of assets, to working on what I deemed the solution, the nirvana, small, locally owned, not-for-profit financial institutions. And within CUNA, I began to understand the lobbying system in Washington, D.C., and how big finance was trying to stop and shut down the credit union movement, and how the organizations are kept small and local so that they don't have any clout and power. They can't aggregate up into larger entities. by various government regulations. Now, I say all of that just to give a brief overview of a sense that I have some clue of what I'm talking about and what I'm about to present. Right? So, what are we presenting tonight? Well, we're going to take a look, a very brief look, at one eminent economist who is part of what's called the heterodox economics movement. Heterodox economics is basically any economist who is in contrast with orthodox economic theory. And there are all these sort of fathers of economic theory. There's the Austrian school. There are various ways in which economics are looked at. And by the way, I have a friend who lives in actually very close to where I live now. We were both in Madison. We've both moved out of Madison. Who is a professionally trained economist. He worked for CUNA, not for CUNA Mutual Group, which is the large company that creates all the products and services for the credit union movement, but the CUNA think tank, which works with the lobbying and with the strategy for credit unions and the credit union movement. And he worked for them, and he went to become a professor at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, but he still provides some consulting services for CUNA. And I talked with him briefly about this topic. We have not yet had time to go into depth on it, but I hope to have him on the show as well here. So there is a reason, stick with this. There's a reason we're covering this, but first we're going to go look at a brief video by Steve Keen. Now this is a longer video. It's actually 3 hours long. This is a video that was recommended by Daniel Sanderson, who was on last week. So this came out of our show last week. Here's the thread that runs through all this. As we talked about the role of religion in society, and as we talked about, the shifts and the moves in global consensus and what's going on this planet, economics and economic theory are driving a lot of questions. We talked briefly about, communism versus capitalism, socialism, those kinds of things, and how human beings are trying to organize societies. We aggregate up and things become ever more complex. So Steve Keen is considered to be an eminent heterodox economics theorist. He's going to give a couple of very keen insights in a couple of very brief segments from this 3.5-hour video that was recommended by Daniel Sanderson last week, which I have not yet gotten through completely, but I'm thoroughly enjoying. And I think you'll enjoy it. So again, I'm going to just splice a couple of really short clips together here, and hopefully the technology will cooperate here, and I will be able to share all this with you as intended.
Life is incredible, and we humans don't respect it enough. We trash it, and that's what economics, I think, has played a huge role in that. So I actually regard my discipline, I would never call it a profession, let alone a science. My discipline has probably helped bring about the termination potential, the feasible termination of human civilization.
Strong words.
So here he is saying that I don't think he uses the word creation, but what we have, this planet, is an incredible gift to us, and yet economics is a discipline which, in his words here, is close to bringing on the termination of all of this, of human society. Again, getting back to those bubbles like I talked about a couple of minutes ago, like the one we had in 2010, where the entire global economy seized up. The entire global economy seized up. And welcome, Daniel. I have just given a lengthy introduction here to the topic tonight, which you teed up by sharing this 3.5-hour video, which is on the screen here. And I'm going to go back and just play a clip here in a second for you and for our audience. very brief, 25 seconds, but Daniel, I spent a little time on my background in the financial services industry, starting with my work at Deloitte, and then my departure from Deloitte to go work for Countrywide. What I will share, Countrywide Financial Company, which the CEO of which, Angela Mozilla, was on the cover of Time magazine January 2009 as the #1 cause of the economic meltdown. I did strategic planning for them, and when I was doing my MBA, I actually wrote a paper on corporate culture comparing Countrywide culture to the mafia, for which I got an A+, and the professor in my MBA program said it was one of the best papers he'd ever read. So what I'm discussing here can be best summarized by these words by Steve Keen from the
Out of it.
from the presentation that you shared with me last week, teeing up this topic. Here we go. I think I missed the first few seconds of this part of the clip anyway, so I'm glad that I'm playing it again.
As a species which sees its role as preserving and respecting life.
I like how you took my silly, incredible statement and made it into a serious one about how amazing life is.
Life is incredible, and we humans don't respect it enough. We trash it, and that's what economics, I think, has played a huge role in that. So I actually regard my discipline, I would never call it a profession, let alone a science. My discipline has probably helped bring about the termination potential, the feasible termination of human civilization.
Strong word.
So Steve Keen, talking about economics, saying that his profession, his discipline, could conceivably bring about the end of human civilization. And I spent a few minutes earlier building up that economic meltdown in 2010, where what happened at that time was the bubble that burst was so massive and so far-reaching in its implications that if you can imagine a car driving down the freeway, speeding at 80 miles an hour, and then suddenly the engine seizes up and that car spins out of control, brakes lock up, it starts to flip over. The global economy, the blood flowing across this planet through all the arteries, the supply chain, all the ships laden with goods in China that need a destination, right? This stuff that's pumping and circulating 24/7 around the planet, all the factories, all the jobs, all of this wealth that's being created, not in terms of, in your bank or your homes that you own, but on an ongoing basis, the goods and services that are flowing around the country, the food that's got to be served in the restaurants where your daughter works as a waitress, all of this stuff was on the verge of seizing up because the ships that were waiting to sail from the ports were on the verge of not going because they would not be received at the other end and the payment for those goods would not be made. And therefore the backlog of goods and products in the factories, and all the factories would shut down. You follow me? So it's like another analogy from the car is like a heart attack, right? A massive heart attack in which all the blood stops flowing and it even stops flowing to the brain. That is the situation that we were facing when here in America, President Obama was elected and began to work out the deals with the banking system and bring, he played a role, and many leaders played a role in bringing society back from the precipice of that heart. The world doesn't know how close we were to that massive economic heart attack at that time. So to me, that's what Steve Keen is talking about when he says my discipline has, potentially brought about the extinction of human life. So, that's just one example. So, Daniel, you've watched the whole show. You recommended. What's your initial reaction to what I'm laying down here on this show?
Yeah, I think you're bringing in a flavor or an understanding that I hadn't quite thought of before. I think because you're immersed in the language of finance a little bit. Well, you just got a different entry point than I do. I know I've spent a lot of time with Steve, and he would respond very directly that it's a neoclassical issue, because he's a post-Keynesian economist, and he's very progressive in trying to move things in more of a dynamic systems approach in studying.
I've got a clip that I'll play on that transition here in a minute, where he talks about how his approach is different, the different mathematics he uses. And I'll share what you also, I can't remember if you heard this just as you were joining, but I have a friend who was with CUNA Mutual Group, where I came after when I moved to Madison. It was to work for CUNA Mutual, which is the backbone of the credit union movement. And I explained to the audience that I went from having a bird's eye view from my position doing strategic planning for Countrywide, and actually riding up and down in the elevator with Mozilla on a number of occasions in that role, helping them to grow and doing negotiations to move or to launch one of their facilities in Clark County, to manage the 1.3 trillion with a T servicing rights that they had maintained on all the mortgage-backed securities that they had sold off in the proverbial sausage making machine in the trading floor with 200 trading people that was in the basement of the headquarters in Calabasas. And Licorice, my daughter's cat, is messing with my microphone here, sorry. So I went from having that bird's eye view to then joining CUNA Mutual Group. Why? Because they were the backbone of the credit union movement, small, locally owned, not-for-profit financial institutions owned by their members, right? And then this friend that I have who worked for CUNA, the think tank that works with CUNA Mutual Group, who is now a professor at the University of Madison, he's an economist. I brought up Keen with him, and he called him, a heterodox,
Yeah.
which means, in contrast with the orthodox theories. And I think it's fair. I looked it up, and yes, that is how he is defined. So very fascinating connections here, and I hope to have my friend on the show at some point in the future. He's going to be a little bit shy, perhaps, about getting in this dialogue in this manner, but we shall see. So let me now play another clip. Actually, it just carries on here. Let me just move it forward just ever so slightly to 4:45 is where we want to start, and we'll hear a little bit about this complexity that Keen is talking about that you intimated here as well.
The metrics, the goals, the models. Practically speaking, what are the goals of economics?
Well, in terms of the tools we use, we should be using the tools that engineers use, frankly. And it sounds ridiculously simple, because you would expect that economists are using up-to-date techniques that are common in other sciences, where you're dealing with similar ideas of stocks and flows and interactions between the environment and a system and so on. And that's fundamentally systems engineering. And that's what we should be using as the tools of economics. Now, if you look at what economists actually do, the sophisticated stuff involves difference equations. And like difference equations, if you've done enough mathematics as you have, difference equations are useful for like individual level processes. If you're talking about an autonomous one, it'll go from state t to t plus 1, t plus 2, and so on. But not when you're talking at the aggregate level. There you use differential equations to measure it all. Economists have been using difference equations. So there's like a book, I think it's by Sargent and one other, called Advanced Methods in Economics Using Python, 2-volume set. It's about close to 2,000 pages, and 4 of those pages are on differential equations. The rest is all difference equations. So they're using entirely the wrong mathematics to start with.
For people listening, what is difference equations versus differential
Okay,
equations?
a difference equation is like you can do.
This is really important here. This is critical.
In a spreadsheet. You'll have, this is the value for 1990, this is the value for 1991, 92, 93, 94. So you have discrete jumps in time. Whereas the differential equation says there's a process moving through time, and you will have a rate of change of a variable is a function of the state of itself and other variables and rates of change of those variables. And that is what you use when you're doing an aggregate model. So if you're modeling water, for example, or fluid dynamics, you have a set of differential equations describing the entire body of fluid moving through time. You don't try to model the discrete motion of each molecule of H2O. So at the aggregate level, you use differential equations for processes that occur through time. And that's economics. It occurs through time.
So what I want to highlight there, and bring let me bring this home for our particular audience who might be, pronouncing a gigantic WTF right now. I thought I was going to learn about the Bible. We will get there. Recall from watching our past few shows that we talked about the origin of the human species in biblical terms as being this wonderful story, this poetic story about the first two humans, our great whatever grandparents, Adam and Eve. And then moving through time, how their decisions and their choices aggregate up at the tribal, the city, the state. And now we have a federated approach with, whatever it is, 7-8 billion people trying to figure out systems that leverage this planet. But it all started, according to the Bible, with this garden and this man, Adam, and a commandment that was given to him, which I'd like to just quickly segue to right now, and then we'll come back to what Keen just said. So let me just read here. I won't actually share it on the screen, just so that we don't have a circus of jumping around here with technology. I'm just going to read it. This is from Genesis chapter 2, and the story of the Garden of Eden. And the Lord, and this is from the New King James Version. And the cat's chewing on the cord now. Better get that stopped. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so here this is all set up. And the Lord God took the man and put him, and this is before the creation of Eve in the story flow. The Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and keep it. So that's the fundamental principle. And as we then take the failure to adhere to that command and the disobedience of not looking at the garden as a heritage to be dressed and kept, but rather as something to be exploited, to take ownership of those trees that were given for food and to turn them into commerce, and then to create complex economic systems that leverage these, in my view, God-given assets for personal gain. And you aggregate that up and you have what you later end up with. This is Genesis. And in the book of Revelation, at the end of the story, you have the beast power, right? You have Babylon the Great, that is not only trading in every manner of goods and services and pharmaceuticals, but also trading in the end in the bodies and souls of men, it says, which of course is slavery at one level and chattel slavery, but then even, spiritually speaking, trading their souls and, all some of the atrocities, organ harvesting and all of that stuff that actually goes on. But you see, economics is somewhere in the mix, in the middle of that. And the Bible also has some things to say about economics, which we'll get into here in a minute. But so Keen was talking about differential equations modeling the flow through time, not just of individual particles of water, but the body of water. So economics, he said he doesn't deem it a science. I think it is a science, or at least it's a wannabe science, or has the potential of being a science, to study how this movement occurs over time. Now, Daniel, you've had a number of conversations with him, and you've obviously got more experience with exactly what he's saying, far more than I do. But I'm just framing it in this context for our particular show and our particular viewers, without trying to add or take away anything from what Keen is saying. What are your thoughts as I frame it in this manner in terms of the goal of human life from a biblical perspective, from a divine perspective, and what we've done with that, and what Keen is doing in terms of trying to understand and model and in some way perhaps even influence in a positive way this function of economic theory and economics in human civilization?
Well, first of all, I would say that the discipline, it's a right description. I think that it's a discipline because from a scientific standpoint, it offers very little in terms of predictability. Not like a Newtonian space or even some of the more traditional sciences. And I think amongst the economists, they understand that there's it's more of an arts degree than it is a hard science. But I mean, that's fine. It's not a point to split hairs. It's just I think that most economists realize
it's a great point, and I'm going to come back to that here in a minute. But go ahead.
So I think what I was excited about, Wade, when I heard you describe this is I got excited for a minute that differential equations and the mathematics could actually be mapped onto our understanding of an almighty creator for the audience, right?
Yes. Let me throw an image up. And audience, this was not planted. Daniel had no clue about any of this, but take a look at this graphic. This graphic is simply a chart of human economic activity since 1805. And I just pulled it off the internet. I knew it existed because I studied into this decades ago in theory. As part of my theology degree and my deep dive into that literal sort of fundamentalist approach to the Bible that I, somewhat uniquely have. This is a graph of economic activity. And again, this is from Australia. It has nothing to do with religion or anything that I'm talking about. It's simply a mathematical graph of economic activity. Red dots are major inflation peaks. Blue dots are major inflation troughs, right? Expansion, contraction, recession, growth, booming. And what we see here is approximately every 50 years, we have this boom and bust cycle, right? So at the aggregate level of human activity in the 1800s, our economy, regardless of whatever theory, because different theories are being used at different times, different methods are being used by the Fed, and globally, the rise and fall of empires has occurred over this time span. But this model of what Keen said of all the particles together over time, this is what it spits out. What's your reaction, Daniel, just to this chart and the sort of mathematical symmetry of it?
And God's got a very interesting heartbeat there.
Well, I don't know that it's God's heartbeat, but it's certainly the heartbeat of the creation that he created, which is And now, since you said divine, I'll jump right into it. I'll jump right into the meat of this since we're already at 7:36. There's a chapter in Leviticus 25. Now remember, we had Adam, and then you go to this big bust and boom from Adam to Noah, right? Where God tells Adam to be fruitful and multiply, and then Noah comes in and it's like, nah, let's wipe them all out, right? So God sort of contradicts his own command there, be fruitful and multiply, and he wipes them all out and saves only Noah and Noah's immediate family. And then you have another expansion cycle, and you get to Abraham where he says, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. And if you can count the stars in heaven or the sands on a seashore, that is the number of descendants that you're going to have. But then you get to Moses, and he takes this, relatively tiny set of tribes that have fallen into slavery in Egypt, pulls them out of Egypt and says, I'm going to make you a shining city on a hill. Now, at that point, we see for the first time in the Bible history, God telling an aggregation of people how to behave, right? Up until then, you don't really have that. There are these vague laws, but now you have a lot of very specific detail purportedly from God. This is what the Bible claims, giving instructions. Here is how you organize your society. And we know all about the 10 Commandments, right? But how many people know that there's an entire chapter devoted to economics? So if you want to put God to the test, if you want to put these ancient scriptures to the test and see if there's any wisdom in them, you could do worse than just looking at this chart and then going back to Leviticus 25. And it is my hope, my fantasy, Daniel, that we might even engage Daniel Keene on this topic at some point and see what he might have to say. Steve Keene, sorry. So let me just now share the text of Leviticus 25, and I've bolded a couple of things. Let me actually expand it here. Looks like you guys are already seeing that part of the screen. So this is Leviticus 25, the instructions to the priesthood under Moses about how to organize the civic and religious, because the society that Moses brought was a society in which religion and state were intermingled, right? And so the religious, the priesthood, the economic system is all tied up. Most people know that the Jews have the seventh-day Sabbath, Saturday, as their day of rest, but few know that there was a land Sabbath. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath, the land shall rest. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord." So here we have an indication that God is backing up that original statement about dressing and keeping the garden and saying, now you're not living in a garden anymore. You're living in an agrarian society, but at the foundation for preservation of the soil and also the sanctity of your cycle of life, every 7th year, you're going to not cultivate that land. You're going to let it lay fallow, and it'll produce what it'll produce on its own, and whatever it produces shall be food for you. And later in this chapter, it says about, you're not going to go in and harvest it, but you can eat of the fruit, and so can the beasts of the field, and strangers, and the poor. And you can sort of, hand pick, but you don't go in and harvest, and you just let it lie fallow. Lots has actually been said about this particular piece in various studies about how advanced this was, because at that time they were already aware that you could deplete the soil through overuse. We've of course overcome that with fertilizer, right? And now we have, see, the global economy, we don't have that fertilizer because of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, right? And now the whole global economy is at risk again in food production, and they're predicting food shortages. But that's not even, it gets much bigger than that. With this next statement, the year of Jubilee, and you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years. And the time of 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. You shall trumpet to sound throughout your land. The Jubilee is a declaration of freedom. Freedom, what kind of freedom? Freedom from debt, right? And in that economic graph, if you dig into it, it is debt that drives that bust and boom. And there's a book that was produced by CUNA, this think tank with CUNA Mutual Group. And when I saw this, I knew I'd come to the promised land when I came to work for CUNA Mutual Group, because it said the debt shall die with the debtor. In other words, the founding of CUNA Mutual Group and the credit union movement was actually based on principles that are similar to what's being done here, that there should be debt forgiveness built in at some point to the economic cycle as a safety valve for these boom and busts. The aggregation of greed and control and ownership is solved by this simple model. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession. And if you sell anything to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor. And according to the number of years of crops, he shall sell to you. According to the multitudes of years, you shall increase its price. And according to the fewer numbers of years, you shall diminish its price. For he sells to you according to the numbers of years of the crops. Therefore you shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. So here, this economic policy is given spiritual religious teeth and enforced. And what this, and I don't want to spend more time digging into this. I would encourage anyone who's interested to really dig into this and study it on their own. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing it now and just give a verbal overlay. I've shown you where it is. It's in Leviticus chapter 25. But what this does, here's the basic premise. The basic premise is Israel was a slave people. They came out of slavery, and God granted them land free and clear. And they were supposed to pay tithes, which is like a religious tax, on the increase of the land. So they owned the land free and clear. They had no mortgage on the land, and their taxes were based on the increase of the assets that they were given free and clear. This land was vested in the families. And if your dad fell on hard times or did really stupid things, gambled away the family inheritance, or was a layabout, didn't work, lost everything, or whether some tragedy occurred, for whatever reason, your father lost the land, you were kind of SOL. But your children, the grandchildren, would get the land back. And of course, it depends on when you were born in the 50-year cycle. But if you had to sell your land, it would revert back to the family. You could not sell land in perpetuity. It always had to revert back to the family. So every 50 years, there was this programmatic level setting, which in that graph that we showed, which I'll just throw that on the screen again. In the graph that I showed, there's no programmatic level setting. There's nothing built into the system that would level that cycle of, some might call it creative disruption, right? But it's actually destroying lives and economies in the process, right? You know, some might say, well, it's a healthy, right? It's capitalism at work. And yeah, it kind of is, but there's a middle ground in which those excessive peaks and valleys would be leveled out through this simple mechanism of building in that minimum ownership standard, a shared ownership, right? It's not a shared entitlement, because in that model of Leviticus 25, you had to go out and work your land or you would lose it, right? You couldn't maintain control of the land in an agrarian society like they had without working hard to make your land produce. But, you know, getting back to Marx, Daniel, and you might have studied into this and enjoy this. Getting back to Marx, right? It's the means of production, right? Now, could this also work, you know, in an industrialized society? Yes, I believe it could. The principle, right? The principle is that you had the means to create wealth. You were taxed on what you created. You could lose it temporarily, but it would revert back to the family. So the next generation would always have that opportunity to build back. So I just find it to be you might say fascinating, interesting. I find it to be proof of the divine authorship of the Bible. That's just my interpretation, that this kind of economic wisdom was written down, thousands of years ago, and today's mathematical, discipline can chart out, and perhaps we could have a discussion on whether I'm smoking crack or whether there's really something here.
Oh, I wouldn't challenge you on it, because I mean, it does seem like a leap of faith to me that you've, I don't know if it was necessarily proof. That doesn't really come to my mind, the way you've described it. But it's definitely inspiring, and it's there's definitely some wisdom behind it, and I think there's some beauty behind that. I think it's that's probably where I wouldn't do any leaping though. Of faith
Well,
there.
so for me, it was just a hypothesis, right?
Right.
It was a hypothesis that was given to me. I'm not the originator of this idea. This was a hypothesis that was given to me many decades ago, long before I went to work for Deloitte Consulting, long before I went to work for Countrywide, long before I got an MBA. But it's something that I have continued to reflect on, right? So it's not an epiphany that I had yesterday, but it's rather a perspective that I've had for decades, and I have not been, it has not been proven wrong to me over all that time, if you follow me.
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time reading the books of Plato, and other philosophers, and there's a reason why I keep going back to the classics. And if you go back to the Bible a lot, I do as well. I mean, not as much as you do, but yeah, I think it's a great source of wisdom and inspiration. It can be, right? Yeah.
So having said that, and sort of brought the audience in and why I'm so interested in this, I also believe that the discipline of keen is important, right? The ability for thinkers, deep thinkers, and people who have the skills and the discipline of that practice to provide guidance as society gets ever more complex, right? As the implications of decisions impact millions of lives, right?
Yeah.
Those troughs and peaks. There are institutions and people with functions. I'll tie it into the news today. We were on the way back from going to pick up some new little baby ducks for the chicken coop that my daughter and I built over the weekend. And we've got chickens in there now, and she wanted to add some ducks to it. So we're really, we're doing the agrarian thing, on our little patch of land here that we've now brought into our family. But on the way back, I was listening to NPR, National Public Radio, which in my view has a very leftist slant. I don't know that's really in dispute. People may not like to hear that, but it does. And they were talking about how we've now had 2 quarters of negative growth, which has always been considered a recession. But NPR went to great pains and, in my opinion, mental gymnastics to try to proclaim that, well, yeah, that's traditional wisdom, but it's technically not correct because there's an institution that evaluates these things and gets to declare whether or not it is in fact a recession. And given this and given that, it's not really a recession at all. And in fact, the economy is actually strong and blah, blah, blah. And it just reminded me of Angela Mazzillo telling Wall Street, he was up ringing the bell for Wall Street because Countrywide was such a high flyer, and Countrywide had established itself not just as a mortgage lender but also as a bank. And they had this incredibly innovative idea in which they opened, so to be a bank, you have to have a vault. You have to take deposits, and to take deposits you have to have a vault. So it's very expensive, right? You have to, and then you have to have security, and it's a lot of capital investment in order to be a bank. Well, Countrywide did not take deposits. They had a FedEx box in their bank outlet in the strip mall. And you could go in there and you placed your deposits in the FedEx box. And so they didn't technically take deposits. And they didn't have to, therefore, have a vault. But they were a bank. And so now they could offer you a better interest rate than your bank. And this was another way that they sucked in, hundreds of millions of your deposit money, which they could then use to buy mortgages with. And they were going out and buying, hundreds of millions of dollars of what's it called? Not prime mortgages, but the subprime mortgages, and then running it through their sausage factory of 200 people on the trading floor in the basement of Calabasas, turning it into that mortgage-backed securities, selling it to the pension fund in Norway. And so the bank had this meteoric rise, right? So I forget. Oh yeah, this is where I was going with this. So, Angelo Mozilla was ringing the bell on Wall Street and proclaiming that the real estate market was healthy while he was selling off $25 million worth of Countrywide stock per week. But it gets worse. Who was buying that stock? Countrywide was, because as the chairman of the board, he had announced a stock buyback plan. Why? Because the market was so healthy. So naturally, our stock is undervalued. So Countrywide was the purchaser of the stock that he was selling, all 100% legit, because he had announced his annual stock selling program to the SEC. Therefore, it was disclosed. Therefore, the market could take it into account. But the market didn't take it into account because Countrywide was buying back the stock and keeping the stock price high. So he was selling his stock at $60 a share, telling the United States from the floor of Wall Street, where whatever it is, where the New York Stock Exchange, that the economy was healthy. When the bubble burst, within a few weeks, Bank of America bought Countrywide for $6 a share.
Wow.
After he had sold all his stock for $60 a share and walked away scot-free because it was all legitimate. This is why I keep going back to Bob Dylan, Subterranean Homesick Blues. Look out, kid, they keep it all hid, right? So my point is, now this statement by NPR about how healthy the economy is sounded exactly like Angela Mozilo telling America that the stock market was healthy. Now, it's being done for different reasons. It's being done now not to prop up the economy so that he can sell his stock. It's being done to prop up the political fortunes of those who may or may not be responsible for the recession, right? Which is not a recession because we're redefining the term. But my point is, and I'm not trying to get political here, I'm just trying to give people insight that we must think deeply. And I'm not saying you should vote this way or vote that way. You should be independently investigating the truth of every matter. And when people start redefining terms and giving a new meaning to a word that meant something different yesterday, now that may or may not be legitimate, right? But you should at least be aware and thinking about it. And so now back to Keene and what he's doing, this gets to heterodox versus orthodox, right? What are the current economic theories? And what should the Fed be doing with interest rates? And does it you in my little peon world, can I do anything about it? Should I worry about it? Well, I'm just a curious person. I just like to know and to understand. I like to ask questions and become wise, right? Whether or not it matters. And to me, it's more fun than watching another fiction show on Netflix, is to understand the fiction that we actually live in, which is this thing called reality, which we create as a species. So I'll stop there, Daniel. I'm eager to hear your thoughts and your input into any and all of this.
Well, as normal, I think it's very interesting the way you frame it and speak about it. You're very knowledgeable, and I really enjoy listening to you, and I'm sure your audience does as well. I would say the approach to me would be to be very forthright with listeners that we need to enter a degrowth situation, manage degrowth, and I think we live under a false god, and I can spell it for you. It's spelled
The almighty dollar.
GDP. So we seem to spell it wrong, and the idea that God is something that we pray to without knowing that we pray to it. We are bound by this false creator. We have no choice but to value happiness based off of, as an aggregate, based off of what we produce. And I think, as a philosopher, I think that's false, immediately false, considering the trajectory and the need to return to the garden, and the need to cultivate and connect with our biodiversity. I think it's completely and utterly false.
So years ago, I saw this little cartoon, The Story of Stuff. You can Google it. And I really, really liked that. That was I think it came out in 2007. It's one of those quick draw animation things. Now, there are, in my opinion, a couple of flaws. I think she overstates her case in a couple of ways, and she does have a view that today, to me, does seem maybe slightly politicized. But she has an incredibly powerful way to describe this thing called the extraction of value, and how those with capital have been able to go in and extract the value from, let's say, mining in Africa. And she describes how you can deliver a $5 transistor radio that is like magic, this magical thing that can give you, communication. And yet it's got all these rare and precious metals and all this engineering built into it and all this shipping costs, and somehow you can buy it for $5. And the reason you can do that is something that she describes as externalizing the cost, right? So there's and this would be really interesting. I think Keene gets into some of this, and as he dives into some of the economic theory, right? And there's the and he talks about how Marx viewed, economics and others, and whether or not, all value comes from the land, or whether you can, talk about human labor and this stuff. So, but the actual cost of that radio exceeds $5. So how can you get it for $5? Because the cost has been externalized in terms of ecological toxicity that was created. And the cost for that is displaced. You're not paying for that cost. The company that extracted the value is not paying for that cost. That cost is borne by other people, right? And so the overall economic equation is completely unfair and inaccurate, because some people are paying way more than you are in order for you to get that $5 radio. But this is a very complex thing to model. But again, the Bible has this brilliant way of describing it in this sort of mix of theological and religious terms. And I just want to conclude now, as we started in Genesis, I want to conclude with a couple of quotes from that chapter 18 of the book of Revelation. And just think of it in this context of how this is describing the ultimate conclusion of that idea of externalizing the cost. This is the ultimate cost that is borne by our greedy, selfish desire, right, to have all that stuff for whatever reason. To your point, Daniel, about degrowth and the need for degrowth. So let me just quickly share a couple of verses here. And this is being pulled directly from the Bible Gateway, which is one of the tools I like to use for Bible study. It's a free tool out there. I use the free version. You can also do a paid version that gives you lots more. But and here you'll see a feature, right? So here you see a little chicken coop, right? So the internet knows that I was researching chicken
Yeah.
coops, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't know that we bought it and that they can stop marketing. But see, this is because of cookies, right? So, and I even use DuckDuckGo, which is supposed to be private. You can go dark, right, on the internet. But we actually bought a chicken coop like this, and we bought, a thing like this. But whenever I go anywhere on the internet, you'll see, why does all this stuff come up? Because I was looking at it the other day and they want to sell it to me. Anyway, sorry, just a little digression there. So Revelation chapter 18, but it's interesting because what we see here on the sidebar is exactly what's being talked about in the biblical text from thousands of years ago, right? The fall of Babylon the Great. Chapter 18, after these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. There are those who see a parallel here in the twin towers of the World Trade Center.
Oh, shit.
I'm just saying. I'm not saying, but I'm just saying. You can go very deep and very weird. There are those who see a parallel there. Babylon the Great is fallen, and it's become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. This powerful imagery. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of earth have committed fornication with her. And the merchants of earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. It is describing a global economic system which surely for the people of that day seemed fantastic, even though they could see sort of where this was coming from and beginning. But it certainly describes the economic systems that govern the planet today, and the G7 and Davos and all these things going on. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven. God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her as she rendered to you, and repay her double, according to her works. In the cup which she has mix double for her. In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord who judges her. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning. And again, this is, some have made the parallel here, the twin towers and the smoke of the burning that from those images was wafting off to sea, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgments have come. And this is what I referred to earlier. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Think of that global seizure of the economic system and the boats sitting at port with nowhere to go because nobody can buy the goods. It is all, suffered a massive heart attack. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet of every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and etc., etc. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance, saying, Alas, alas, that great city! For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance, and they cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning. Again, as I referenced earlier, there are some who see a parallel here. There's actually another verse, or maybe I skipped over it, where it talks about, here we go, I skipped over it. Talking about all the things that are being traded: wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. A truly abysmal situation, right? This is describing really the world that we see today. And unless we change our ways and become less greedy, become less selfish, become more equitable, have more concern for those who are suffering while we live in luxury, it will not end well, right? As we have aggregated up to a global society, the decisions that we make as individuals, as cities, as countries, as tribes, as races, whatever aggregation of people you can imagine, the choices and the decisions that we make with our freedom of choice, that goes back to that Garden of Eden that we were told to dress and keep, this is how it aggregates up for good and for bad. Now, I want to throw out one more little analogy. I lived in Germany for almost a decade, and when I first moved there, the Iron Curtain was still up. And I remember traveling behind the Iron Curtain where there were bread lines, right? Because the economy didn't work. The economies of the East European countries and Russia did not work. And part of the reason that wall came down and the Iron Curtain collapsed is because the flow of information was such that people began to realize that they were being fed propaganda by the Russian newspaper Pravda, which means truth. Right? Mm-hmm. The magazine Truth was not telling the truth. And as they began to learn that all these horrible things they were being taught about how capitalism and how terrible it is and how people are suffering, no, people were living like kings just over that wall from the people who were standing in bread lines because they couldn't get bread to eat, right? And that centralized, controlled economy was also not working. And now that's all collapsed, and we have this global interrelated economy, but it's aggregated up and continues to spin out of control. And this is how this side of it looks from the other side of that wall, right? But that description of all the manner of goods, I remember one friend who might possibly even be listening into this broadcast. His wife was from East Germany, and he said when she, and I forget how exactly it was that she was able to come over earlier on, because I think they got married before the wall came down. But the first time she stood in a Western supermarket, she was paralyzed and broke down crying because there were not because there were just so many choices. She didn't know how to shop. She didn't know what to buy, and it was just such a shock, and it troubled her so deeply. Just, there are 50 kinds of peanut butter in the United States, right? 50 different kinds of peanut butter, and you can't even get peanut butter in, Western Europe, much less Eastern Europe, right? Of course, there are things you can get there you can't get here, but my point is just this description can really only fit today's world, right? It is a prophetic vision of the situation that we're facing today. And this question of economics, having gone away from that model which says you should build in debt for forgiveness, you should build in a land Sabbath, you should have a just and equitable economic system, which is the law of the land, which is some kind of middle ground between these different theories. So I love that that you've introduced me to Steve Keen, Daniel, and that he's heterodox and that he's willing to challenge orthodoxy and look at this from a different perspective. I'll stop there and let you provide any last minute words of wisdom and comments, because I've gone on and on with my perspectives here, but hopefully the listeners and you have found them interesting and thought provoking.
Okay, Wade. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll pull it back to you because I'm really fascinated where the Bible actually takes this. If there's anything in terms of prediction or advice on how to handle this, but I to build on what I was talking about earlier about the false idol or the god of GDP. I'm curious about your perspective too on more of a realistic nationalistic play. Now, of course, I sit probably left of center to give the listeners a little bit of background of my political bias.
Well, you are Canadian.
Yeah, well, yeah, there we go. Well, yeah, so maybe a little socialist too, right? But no, I mean, I think somebody asked me why I do that, and I was born in Alberta, which is kind of like a mini version of Texas, and I think I really understood and continue to understand the conservative perspective. There's part of me that deeply hopes or wishes and simultaneously I'm confused as to why the conservative agenda doesn't pick up this gardening, tending thing. It's like it's been picked up by the wrong team.
Well, I think on that front, it's for every action there's an equal and something reaction.
Yeah.
I think there's a polarization going on. And you look through political history, and what the Republicans used to do is what the Democrats used to do, but now they've swapped roles, right? Mm-hmm. And they dance around like electrons and protons and neutrons, right? In terms of having to have an opposing view. And I think that most conservatives do actually have a piece of them that is perhaps even more connected to the land than most liberals, right? You look at where they come from, right? So you've got these massive cities, right, in New York and Los Angeles. Guess what? They're disconnected from all of this, and they're very liberal, right? They might, and don't take this the wrong way, but there's a lot of virtue signaling going on all sides of the issues, talking about it, but not actually doing anything about it. And so you get this weird inability to find common ground that is increasingly the big problem. But to your point, to bring it back home, here's something else that, going back to the Old Testament, and I've talked about this a lot, I'm probably with you as well, in a previous incarnation of this show, but there's the A word, abomination. God says it is an abomination to have two sets of weights, right? One to buy and one to sell. Now that doesn't mean you can't have a buy rate and a sell rate, right? Doesn't mean you can't, buy wholesale and sell retail in order to have a shop or a business. But what it does mean is you can't have deceptive weights to where the person you're dealing with suddenly doesn't realize that you're using a different set of weights, right? It's like when you go to an exchange window for foreign currency, you see the buy and the sell rate there. That's okay to have two different prices, but it's not okay to have a scale that cheats, right? That cheats. And the reason I say this, that's kind of like at the individual micro basic building block level. The economy is built on lies and hypocrisy. This whole thing about look out kid, they keep it all hid, and one set of rules for the rich and one set of rules for the poor, right? And that people have access to certain knowledge and use and abuse that. Insider trading is one example, but just one of a million different examples of how this works. So it's the hypocrisy, right? The reason two sets of weights, and I've described this, it's hypocrisy, right? It's a double standard, right? Which is treating two things that are the same as though they're different. And it's a false equivalency, which is treating two things that are different as though they're the same. And this is why it matters that we're redefining terms. When we had two back-to-back periods of negative growth, you can bet the Democrats said that that was a recession when the Republicans were in power and vice versa. But they redefine it for themselves so that they can benefit. This is the micro level. It's that truthfulness and that honesty and that integrity, right? And so, again, this system that was given from Sinai to Moses had that integrity built into it, the recognition that it's not okay, right? And yes, I will throw it out there. It's not okay that the foundation that Bill Gates funded went and bought another, whatever it was, 2,100 acres of potato farm today, right? That the land is being aggregated in the hands of global entities. It's not okay what's going on in Holland around the farmers, right? Who were encouraged and almost forced into farming a certain way for food production. And now, with very limited warning, they're being told they can no longer farm that way. And they're losing their lands and they're losing their livelihoods in some kind of massive takeover attempt, some would say, right? Some would say that this is being orchestrated to remove these individual farmers from the land and to aggregate the land under the control of those who think they know better how to use that land, right? So, and I'm not even saying that's right or wrong. I'm not going there. I'm just saying that systemic integrity has to be, things have to be thought through, and there has to be honesty and integrity built into it. And that model in Leviticus has that. It builds in the land Sabbath. It builds in the Jubilee year into the fabric of all the transactions that aggregate up. You can't have this aggregation of wealth and ownership into a few major global corporations or governments when every 50 years the land reverts to somebody else. You can't ever fully take over and control and own it. I don't know if you ever played Risk, right? That game Risk as a kid. But we had a version of this that we played in Sweden out on the dirt with a big stick. And you would draw this big circle. And you would each have a stick of approximately the same size. And you could reach over and you could like carve out some of the circle from your opponent. Mm-hmm. And the goal was to try to get all the land in that circle and force the other guy out. By in that sense, learning how to own and control the space, right? Games that children can play that are sort of fun to learn how to interact, but it's not fun when it aggregates up at a global level with many, many layers of people and wealth and control and authority. And then you have what's described here in the book of Revelation, because the people themselves are not acting with honesty, morality, and integrity, which gets back to what Leviticus 25 is really all about, is the integration of a moral structure within civic society, which is probably what Plato was talking about.
Yeah, the greater good, right? That's a good pinnacle to point towards.
So there you have it. We're over time. We've talked about economics destroying the world, or maybe not. Daniel, thank you for joining. Perhaps, I don't know if you can plant a bug in Mr. Keen's ear. Would love to have him on to talk at some point, or I'll continue to watch his broadcast. But I think this is an interesting topic about how the world is structured. And again, the program is called Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. We hope you'll subscribe and like and share, and send in your questions and comments, and we'll hopefully do a show that's of interest to you and those like you out there. Daniel, thanks for joining, and everyone, have a great evening.
Okay, guys. Thanks.